Hello, welcome. My name is Edwin Sorensen. I'm the creator of Ctruth, and in this video I present part 2 of the general introduction to Edwin Johnson's Rise of English Culture. You can find the rest of the videos in this series in the playlist dedicated to this book on the Ctruth YouTube channel. Without further ado, here is my audiobook version recording. It has been obviously objected to me. You say that the monastic or Christian literature is at least 1,000 years younger than it has been declared to be. How can such an extraordinary deception or illusion have been possible? The answer is that when books were rare and prized on the mere ground of a real or supposed antiquity which men had no means of measuring, anything could be asserted, anything believed, and nothing could be contradicted. The Jews have a well-known book on the creation. When it was brought to light, probably not before the revival of letters, the question would be asked, how old is this book? It is very old. How old? Perhaps of the time of Abraham. Surely that is too old. Well, then perhaps it is one of the time of the Emperor Hadrian. Neither the one statement nor the other amounts to more than a vague figure of speech. When, from the jealous seclusion of the monasteries, the writings ascribed to St. Jerome were produced at the era of publication, it was said, "These writings are more than 1,000 years old." The statement could not be authoritatively contradicted, although, doubtless, by a few classical scholars, it was entirely disbelieved. It was gradually found to be useless to argue with the masters of a legion of subservient penmen. A chorus noisily affirmed what but a solitary had here and there the courage and the knowledge to deny. The bold pretension so passed into accepted convention, although there was not a scholar who could trace the transmission of books downwards from 1,000 years before the erection of the printing press. The statement merely amounts to this. The writings are very old, that is, in our chronological scheme, 1,000 years old and more. It was received because the assertors were masters of the literary situation and on no other ground. But during these 400 years we have gained, and are always gaining, conquests over the vague or indefinite imagination by a variety of more defined experiences. And the scholar is now guilty of rashness or idle conceit who serenely says, "I see no reason to doubt that the Hieronyman writings were composed a long 1,000 years before the people knew anything of the Bible." For he assumes that he can penetrate an obscurity which no scholar of the revival was able to penetrate. The cautious and sober critic, on the other hand, has great advantages over the critic of the revival, because so many things that were once secret have become fully known. So many things once whispered in the ear have been published on the housetop. We have all imbibed and absorbed, more or less, the human experience of the last 400 years, and are able to look over the shoulders of a Bacon and a Selden, a Polydore Virgil, or Erasmus, or Luther, or a Lawrence Valla. We have greater knowledge of our early ignorance. We can now perceive that the reason why scholars so willingly yielded to the spell of St. Jerome is because they had no 4th or 5th century taste, but a 16th century taste. Jerome, says Dr. Westcott, the present Bishop of Durham, writes like a 16th century scholar. He is so indeed. The Jesuits are 16th century men, and they say that Luther was the spiritual child of St. Austin. Naturally, he was an Austin friar. Not that it could be proved that St. Austin, dead 1,000 years agone, rose again in the person of the reforming friar. They say that St. Austin was the spiritual child of St. Paul, not that it could be proved that St. Paul had deceased from the world 400 years before St. Austin. These literary saints existed for the purposes of chronological literary catalogues brought to light at the era of publication. The Pauline, the Augustinian, the Lutheran doctrines made a noise in the world at the same time. I fail to trace the principle of justification by faith beyond Luther. It is, in fact, the innovation of his time. After all the discussion which has gone on in recent years upon the Wyclifian writings, it can be no rashness to assert that there was no talk of John Wycliffe and his connection with Bohemia until the eve of the Great Schism. That there was no talk of either of the Wycliffes until the reign of Henry VIII. That the name is allegorical and ideal, significant of the strong body of reformers in certain colleges and religious houses. The possibility of attaining an insight into former times is the possibility of constructing for ourselves a mental telescope. A mental telescope must be constructed from the lenses of the eyes of contemporary observers. We must borrow the spectacles of a good observer for a view of any particular period of the past. It will be found that such good observers are very rare and hard to find, because the power to see what actually is and then faithfully to report it implies high intellectual and moral qualities. A man must have the taste for science as distinct from the taste for fable, and he must be at fair liberty to gratify it. Such a man was Francis Bacon in the morning of our English culture. Whatever might be urged as to the bias under which even he wrote, there can be no question that a better witness cannot be cited as to the state of letters and science in our own world at the beginning of the 17th century. Let us for a moment, then, look through his eyes and learn something of the state of historic knowledge during the age that had passed. Bacon, in the advancement of learning, relates history to memory, which implies that it was something to be recited and got by heart, like the plot or argument of a fable. He divides theology into church history, parables, and precept. Prophecy, he says, is a supernumerary part, and is simply divine history before the fact. So that by a simpler classification, church precept may be clothed in three forms: history, parable, and prophecy, which are substantially the same. But he has another division. History, he says, is national, civil, or ecclesiastical, and literary. Of these, the three first are extant, but the fourth is defective. Bacon does not note that all these branches had been in the hands of clergymen, and of them alone. But on literary history, he makes the important observation that the general state of learning from age to age has never been described. For want of this, the history of the world seemeth to me to be as the statue of Polyphemus with his eyes out, that part being wanting which doth most show the spirit and life of the person. Bacon does not add that without such a history of letters the student cannot see any statue at all. He goes on to say that in particular sciences there have been set down some small memorials of the schools, authors, and books, also some barren relations touching the invention of arts and usages. But a just story of learning, in all its branches, is still wanting. He appears to feel that there is no history in the proper sense of the world without this previous story of letters. The fact is that it could not have been written in his time, nor until the time of the Benedictines of St. Maur. Again, Bacon divides just and perfect history into chronicles, or representations of a time, lives of persons, and narrations or relations of actions. He deplores the unworthy manner in which the history of England has been written, and the partiality and obliquity in the latest history of Scotland. There is great need of one history of the island. If the period from the uniting of the roses to the uniting of the kingdoms were only adequately written, Bacon, it will be recalled, did attempt a history of the reign of Henry VII, but it will be found that he did not because he could not, add a word of genuine information respecting that king which had not been written down by Polydore Virgil nearly 100 years before his time. Bacon knew that it required uncommon ability to write good history. He is a witness to the fact that it was impossible for the ablest man to write it, simply because actions memorable had not been tolerably reported as they passed. If this state of things, of which Bacon is not the only witness, had been duly noted by students since his time, there would not have been so great a waste of art on the subject of English history or of church history in general. Bacon is embarrassed in referring to church history. He appears to hint that it is artificial. There is abundance of it. Only, he sighs, I would the virtue and sincerity of it were according to the mass and quantity. Did he say to himself that it was a branch of poesy? That is, nothing else but feigned history which may be styled as well in prose as in verse? And that its use was to give some shadow of satisfaction to the mind of man in those points wherein the nature of things doth deny it? Let me come to the name of another Englishman who is justly held to be one of the great ornaments of our nation, an Englishman of the highest quality for the task of the historian, who attempted to supply that desideratum of literary history so keenly felt by the great scholar of King James's time. I refer to Henry Hallam, whose works remain the monument of his industry, patience, his noble and disinterested zeal for truth and liberty. With deep respect for the memory of Hallam, I have to point out a serious, though not singular, defect in his account of the literature of Europe after the decay of the Roman Empire. The defect lay in this, that Hallam never gave special attention to the analysis of monastic literature, that is, the Benedictine literature, and appears to have been unaware of the extent to which suspicion had overclouded that literature from the end of the age illustrated by the name of Bacon. Hallam betook himself to the modern Benedictine literary history of France and to other compilations of the writings of the order, and he accepted their chronology as if it had been founded on record. He repeats the fable that Isidore of Seville and Cassiodorus flourished in the general ignorance of the 6th century. That ignorance, he believes, continued for about 5 long ages. He says that Saint Benedict bade his brethren read, copy, and collect books, but was silent as to their nature. He alludes to the tales of monastic culture in Ireland, to the tales about Alcuin and Bede, and the cathedral schools under Charlemagne. He arrives at the intellectual night of the 10th century. He comments on the want of genius, the prevalence of bad taste, the deficiency of poetical talent during the Dark Ages. But he does not inquire as to the possibility of writing a story of such ages. He holds to the faint clue supplied by the fathers of St. Maur to the rise of the universities in the scholastic philosophy, the beginnings of modern poetry, and so on. But unfortunately, he leaves the all-important question as to the rise of a reading or writing class among the laity unexplored. Again, he copies unverified and unveracious statements from the Benedictines upon this subject, and brings the sketch of some 900 years in his first chapter to an unsatisfactory close amidst still dense ignorance. He was not aware that he had been contemplating an imaginary retrospect, which had only come fully into view since the time of Bacon. The Benedictine literary history of France reveals, when critically examined, the collaboration of the monks in Normandy with those in England in the writing of the plausible tales connecting the fortunes of the two peoples. It is true that Hallam could not make much of the tales about Lanfranc and Anselm, but he supposes that John of Salisbury marked some advance in education at the end of the 11th century. He is willing to trace a little further improvement in the next age. Yet, When he comes to the 13th century, he points out the incredible ignorance of elementary grammar in the writers assigned to that period. Roger Bacon is not a good writer. The manuscripts of these latter ages, before the invention of printing, are by far the most numerous, but they are the most incorrect and generally of little value. Hallam did not perceive that this age and its literature is still imaginary. He passes on to the next. The 14th century was not in the slightest degree superior to the preceding ages. France, England, and Germany were wholly destitute of good Latin scholars. The writer called Richard Ongerville of Bury, poor as he is, in the estimate of Hallam, does not belong to this age. He is another masked Benedictine and belongs in all probability to the early Tudor period. That a library was bequeathed by him to Oxford is a mere fable, as also the statement about a royal library of 900 volumes at Paris. Still adhering to the Benedictine scheme of centuries, Hallam nevertheless finds that in Italy the ignorance was very great in the middle of the 14th century, so that a man supposed to be learned took Plato and Cicero for poets. But we come to the name of Petrarch, the first real restorer of polite letters, the aspirant after pure Latin. The question arises, when did the writings ascribed to Petrarch the clerk first come into reading? Hallam, copying his dates from the compilers, has not raised the question. If he had done so, he would have seen how slight were the grounds for crediting the existence of the writings and of the tale about this scholar long before Erasmus. Not a book from the library which Petrarch is said to have collected and to have left behind him has come down to us. Although the tradition about Petrarch comes to us from 16th century scholars like Cortarius, their lists of learned men were contrived on a similar system. Their general principle was that classical learning revived in Italy towards the end of the 14th century. It was vague guesswork eked out by invention. Let me follow Hallam a little way in his discussion of the state of letters in the 15th century. Italy was undoubtedly in advance of the rest of Europe, yet our historian sees clearly that not until the latter half of that age did good Latin set in. Our information as to the lives of scholars like Poggio and Valla is still vague and in great part made up of general conjecture. I would invite the reader to remember that it was only as monarchic institutions were beginning and the foundations of civilization were being slowly laid, that what Hallam calls the barbarous jargon of monks gave way to the refined rhetoric of the Latin humanists. The jargon denotes the first efforts of monks in Latin composition, but the Latin Bible text shows a gradual improvement, and the best historic compositions of the monks date, all of them, from the late 15th or early 16th century. Well may Hallam speak of the resuscitation of the Greek language in Italy as a very important event in literary history. The scattered traces which he believed he found of the study of Greek in the monasteries during the Middle Ages are not real. They are merely fictions of the Benedictine who writes as Bede and others of the same fraternity who were beginning to push their writings into the light during the reign of Henry VIII. Polydore could find only 2 copies of Gilda about the year 1525, and his copy of Bede was imperfect. Greek is here seen to be in its infancy as a study. Hallam, however, still turning the pages of the literary history of France, cites some legends of the monasteries of Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, Saint Denis, and Saint Germain-des-Prés in Paris. Of the monasteries of Saint Gall and of Cologne, of Saint Albans, and so on. He appears to half believe them, but would wholly have discredited them had he seen that it was part of the system to give the air of more learning than was actually possessed to these noted seats of monastic culture. Among the incredibilities copied by Hallam is the story of Italian universities founded in the 14th century and immediately dying out, of decrees for the establishment of professorships of Greek and Oriental tongues which remained a dead letter, and the existence of some 10 persons in Italy who could read Homer in the time of Petrarch. At last, Hallam fixes on the arrival of Chrysoloras, but the date of Chrysoloras has never been correctly given, for the simple reason, unknown to Hallam, that the humanists of the 16th century who make these statements were only beginning to use the system of dating by the years from the Incarnation, and that, no registers having been kept, it was little more than guesswork when they said Greek was revived about 100 years ago. They were, however, well aware that there was no Greek in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. Our chief authority, L. Aretino, says in an oft-quoted sentence that Greek had been lost in Italy for 700 years before Chrysoloras. In other words, according to this compute, 700 to 1400. I would call pointed attention to this saying. It was easy to write down the phrase 700 years, but it may be well asked what reason the scholars of the revival had for assuming this terrible chasm in the life of culture. That the beautiful speech of Homer and of Plato, which gives, in the words of Gibbon, a soul to the objects of sense and a body to the abstraction of philosophy, should have fallen dead during a period hardly comprehensible by the imagination of man, a period of which I have again and again observed, the story has never been truly or even approximately told. There is here a great illusion, the origin of which it may be possible to explain. A corresponding statement was that of the Moors when they said in the time of Ferdinand and Isabella, "We have been 700 years and more in Spain, and we have a title to the land." It is the interested statement of a people whose culture had not very long begun, and who had the usual motives to exaggerate their claims to antiquity. It was the Muslim scholars who led the way in the revival of Greek, and it was they who were primarily responsible for this notion of the extinction of the old Greco-Roman culture during the period of their domination in Europe. There can be no doubt whatever that the period has been guessed rather than recorded, and that the supposed rapidity of the Muslim conquests in Africa and Spain, with the long endurance of their dominion, are ideas that have been derived from the poetic retrospection and legendary narrative. There can be no doubt whatever that the period has been guessed rather than recorded, and that the supposed rapidity of the Muslim conquests in Africa and Spain, with the long endurance of their dominion, are ideas that have been derived from poetic retrospection and legendary narrative. Their dominion was no doubt long, but the probability of the case would be satisfied were we to assume that 2 or 3 centuries of barbarism had elapsed between the Arab conquest of the Mediterranean and the capture of Constantinople by the Turks. Nor can we explain to ourselves the enthusiasm with which the Italian scholars addicted themselves to Latin and Greek at the epoch of the revival, had those tongues been so strange and dead as they are supposed on the conventional theory to have been. I have lingered with Hallam because of the eminence of the man, and because of the strict and lawyer-like habit he constantly shows of carefully weighing evidence. If a man like this made an unsatisfactory report on the state of letters in Europe before the era of publication, it was because, like compilers much less careful, he did not narrowly enough examine the few writers from whom the statements originally proceeded. Whether they were monks or classical enthusiasts, 2 classes of men between whom there was little sympathy. That concludes part 2 of Edwin Johnson's general introduction to the rise of English culture. Be sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment, tell me something that you learned while listening to this video. Until next time, never stop seeking the truth about chronology.